Okay. Today we're going to talk about the impact of European religious systems in the colonies, largely Christianity, and how the kind of early Christian colonists thought about the Native Americans and how they considered Native American religion, religious ideas, Native American just behavior, and they'll try to convert Native Americans to Christianity. And quickly after that, in the early 1500s, quickly after contact, the Europeans will undergo their own reformation of the Christian religion. So that's a major important event that kind of reverberates throughout Europe for at least 150 years and will have long-term consequences for the European colonies in what we today call Latin America. All right, so we'll start off talking about what the Europeans thought of Native American religion and Native American belief systems and behaviors and whatnot in relationship to Christianity. And to put it pretty bluntly, the Europeans generally judged the Native Americans as inferior, as kind of barbaric, and used those types of definitions and stories about their nakedness and their reports of cannibalism and human sacrifice to prove their innate theories of inferiority amongst the Native Americans, that the Europeans are superior to them, and that the Europeans should have the power to rule over them and try to make the Native Americans more like Europeans, to kind of convert them to European religion and then try to teach them how to live in European social settings and interact with European-style economies and whatnot. So the colonizers will often defend the Native Americans as subhuman, as inferior, in order to justify their conquests, their plunder, and their enslavement of the Native Americans and their kingdoms and empires. But not all colonizers believe that. Not all Europeans believe that. There's a conversation amongst Europeans and an argument. Some Europeans thought that the Native Americans seemed more innocent and driven by a kind of natural instinct, and even seemed almost Christ-like in their kind of childishness or their innocence or something like that, and that the Native Americans are kind of a pure, uncorrupted bunch of different groups that are kind of childlike and are open to conversion to Christianity. So you have two different kind of wild interpretations, both based in kind of their inferiority of Native Americans, but some Europeans want to kind of conquer the area and force Native Americans to live in European lifestyles and possibly enslave them in order to force them to do that. And other Europeans see the Native Americans as innocent and uncorrupted, and that they should be converted to Christianity so that they can continue with that innocence and kind of purity and whatnot. So a lot of religious leaders are afraid that if the natives are enslaved or if they're kind of brutalized in some way, that will destroy their innocence and will corrupt them and will make them much more difficult to convert to Christianity and lead toward what they think is the correct path and interpreting what God wants people to do. So many early Christian leaders defined the Native Americans as kind of infidels, as people who had rejected Christ or something like this. But other religious leaders criticized that idea and said that if you're going to define someone as an infidel, as someone who refuses the religion, that means that they have to have learned about Christianity and they have to have been offered conversion and had to have fully rejected it. So a lot of early Christian leaders say that kind of Muslims or Jews or someone like that, those are the infidels because they knew about Christianity and they actively chose to do something else. Whereas the Native Americans largely had never heard of Christianity, so this is all news to them. So it's hard to call someone an infidel if they haven't formally rejected the idea yet, because the Europeans have just arrived and kind of brought the idea to them. One of the Native Americans' kind of biggest defenders is actually a pope at the time in the 1530s, Pope Paul III, who officially declared natives as full humans with souls who could receive Christianity and who could be converted to Christianity, and they should therefore not be enslaved. They should not be forced into labor, that they should be convinced to live in European society. But of course, a lot of the greedy colonizers refused those ideas because those ideas do not work for what the colonizers want, which is to use the Native Americans as a labor source for the colonial landowners to enrich themselves off of. And if that labor source had to be based in slavery, so be it. So a lot of the colonizers rejected a lot of the Pope's ideas and a lot of the Catholic Church's ideas, or the Christian Church's ideas, because it just didn't work for the colonizers' economic interests. So the church kind of defines its first mission as going into the Americas, and they're really pretty optimistic. They have a lot of utopian type of ideas about how to kind of save the natives, or at least how to train the natives how to live in a European colonial society, how to interact with Europeans, while also teaching them to avoid and shun the kind of corruption that Europeans brought, which is, greed, immorality, and a lot of church leaders will even try to help some of these native groups escape forced labor conditions like slavery. So that kind of causes a lot of conflict between the Catholic leaders, the Christian leaders, and the colonizers who want that labor source. But of course, the church came into the Native American regions with the goal of converting natives, which of course gave a theoretical justification for colonization in the first place. A lot of the colonizers can say, we're just tagging along and creating these kind of encomiendas and other land-based agricultural systems on the kind of piggybacking on what the church is doing, doing the good work of trying to convert the natives to Christianity. So a lot of the church leaders, they go in with some pretty big goals of basically trying to save the world and save all these peoples who had never heard of Christianity. The problem, though, is that there's simply never enough Christian clergy, church clergy, going into the Native American areas, or at least even going into the colonized areas, to serve the very large native populations. So there just wasn't enough kind of church infrastructure and employees there to try to convert or try to convince the natives in large groups to convert to Christianity. So the lack of church infrastructure will give an open opportunity for a lot of natives to either fully escape official conversion or to try to build some kind of amalgam religion between the native beliefs and the Christian practices that they're starting to be taught. And it also opened the door for a lot of kind of religious imposters, church imposters, to travel through the colonies and charge fees for certain kind of church-based services like baptism or marriages or something like that. So there's even some con men that are kind of moving through the colonies with kind of fake documents saying that they are official church members and leaders, and they're charging fees to make money for themselves. As basically con men, and they could be caught and punished by the government or the church if they were caught. So they could be whipped publicly, they could be exiled, all sorts of things could happen to them. But it also gave opportunity for the natives to try to retain their own individual beliefs or their cultural beliefs in afterlife ideas, or just their own cultural norms that the Christian leaders were trying to kind of force out of them. So a lot of Native Americans will build these amalgam religious ideas that combine a lot of Native American beliefs that were already around before the Europeans showed up, and combine them with Christian beliefs or Christian ideas or idols or artifacts like that, because the two religions often were pretty close. They had a lot of similar beliefs, if not in the official titles of and names of the kind of characters in the stories, but they have a lot of beliefs in the kind of sanctity of virginity, or the idea of an afterlife, or the idea of certain religious leaders being tortured to death by some dastardly government authorities that were enemies of the people or something like that. And they had certain religious leaders that they venerated as types of saints and whatnot. And they had artifacts and idols for their religions. So there is some kind of crossover between a lot of Native American beliefs and Christianity of the early 1500s. So a lot of Native groups would kind of conflate the two religions together, even though the church would try to stop that and tell them that kind of any compromising or combining of Native American beliefs with Christian beliefs is not Christianity, and they would try to stop the natives from doing that. But again, many natives would continue kind of conflating the two together, and probably the most famous instance of that is the native goddess Tonantzin. So this was a Native American goddess that they would start to call God, and they would kind of treat this goddess as the kind of creator god, and which very obviously angered a lot of the Christian church leaders that are in the area, and the church leaders would try to destroy those native beliefs in that goddess. So the church would instead try to push veneration of large temples and icons and things like that throughout what we today call Latin America. And probably the most famous instance of that is Our Lady of Guadalupe icon in present-day Mexico City, or just north of Mexico City. So that probably becomes the most famous Christian spot or icon or temple in all of New Spain, and possibly in all of Latin America, for both natives and Spanish colonizers alike. And so that's kind of the bases of the religious types of conflicts and attempts at conversions that's going on in the very early 1500s up until the 15 teens or so in especially the Spanish colonies. And we have a big change that happens in Europe in the 15 teens, which goes back to what had become known as the sale of indulgences. And this is something that the Christian church under the Pope had been doing for a long time, decades and even centuries. The sale of indulgences was an attempt by the church to raise money, most historians believe because they need funding to build a new basilica in Rome. So some church leaders way before the year 1500, before our class kind of gets going, had come up with this idea that they could sell what they call indulgences to people just out there around Europe to raise money to build what the church is trying to build. The idea of an indulgence is really that a person, a European, could go to their local parish priest or their local church, and they could buy a future indulgence, which would mean basically that you could go in on Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon, and you could say, I'm planning to have this big party on Saturday night, and there's going to be a lot of kind of sinful activity, a lot of drinking or gambling or sex or something like that. It's going to be a pretty wild party. So the people that plan to either attend or even throw the party go to the church in the middle of the week, a few days before at least, and they buy permission to indulge in these kinds of actions. So they put their money down ahead of time so that the church is giving them permission to indulge in these actions. And it's basically saying that if you die on Saturday night doing this stuff before you can come to church on Sunday and repent, you will not go to hell, or God will not punish you for those actions. So you're buying basically a kind of get out of hell free card in advance for the actions that you hadn't even done yet. So that became known as the sale of indulgences. And this really angered quite a lot of people throughout Europe, wherever this is going on. And it generally angers a specific portion of the population. And that's really the average workforce, because this is still feudal Europe, and the peasant serfs don't really work for money. They work for the permission to live on the land and a cut of the harvest so they can feed their family and survive. So a lot of the peasant farmers all around Europe, they don't really have money. They don't have cash to buy these indulgences. So the game's not really open to them. And they're very angry about it because the people they work for, the big landowners, they're the ones that have all the money. They're the ones that have all the coins in Europe for the most part. And the kind of people superior to them, the political leaders and the kings and whatnot. So the kind of landowners are the rich people of the area who have the money to buy indulgences, and they have the money to throw the big parties in their houses in the first place. So the indulgences tend to get sold to the wealthier landed elite. So the people who have the money love the system because they can have all their fun and get away with it, and the poor people throughout the areas are very angry at this because they don't have access to it. So this kind of public anger, the church is very good at kind of quashing that public anger, not letting it vent, because it would obviously be very critical of what the church was doing. So there's a lot of accusations that the kind of church is selling out its mission to save people and whatnot. So there's that feeling of anger amongst the people, just kind of floating around Europe in the early 1500s, and it really comes to a head under a church priest himself named Martin Luther. So in 1517, Martin Luther starts publicly complaining about the sale of these indulgences, this whole system. And he nails a list of his complaints on the local church door, which was kind of like the local bulletin board, and kind of advertised his complaints to the local area that he was working in. And people read it, and it's just, a lot of the average people agree with it because they hate that system too. So that gets Martin Luther a kind of big name for himself in the area. And then he publishes a book in 1517 called The Disputation Against Scholastic Theology, which basically argues that righteous deeds, good works basically, will not get you out of hell. That good actions do not make you a good person in God's eyes. So just doing good things around is not a guarantee that God will judge you well when you die and let you into heaven. So he says that you should try to be righteous as a person. You should live a good life instead of just doing good deeds out in the public. That in your kind of daily existence and in your own mind, you should try to be as good of a person as you possibly can, because there's con men out there who do good works in order to try to get into heaven, even though they're kind of rotten people in their own daily lives. So that book becomes kind of a bestseller, and then his even bigger book, The Sermon on Indulgence and Grace, he publishes in 1518, which is a direct, full frontal attack on the sale of indulgences and kind of exposes the whole system for everyone to learn about. And remember, he was a church functionary himself. He worked for the church. So he had taken part in these systems and was disgusted by it. So he was an insider who knew how this stuff operated, and published this book that didn't just describe how it operated, but directly accused it of being completely sinful, and saying that the church has to stop doing this, and that this is just one instance of all these other problems that the church has. So this book is the one that really gets the event that becomes known as the Reformation started. This book becomes a major bestseller. Everyone who really knows how to read basically reads this book and kind of is talking about it and thinking about it. It's a big fad in Europe. And even the people who can't read often have it read to them. So even the kind of illiterate peasants hear about this book and hear about the ideas in it, and they get very angry about things. So this whole movement develops out of Martin Luther's works, where a lot of people in Europe start calling for a reform movement. They want to alter the way the church functions. They want to reform it. They want to make it better. And that writ large across all of Europe, this kind of complaint becomes known as the Reformation, the attempt to reform the church, to get rid of these evils and these corruptions and whatnot. So Luther is now famous all over Europe. He's one of the most famous writers, intellectuals of his time at this point. So there's quite a few people, especially some of the religious and political elite, that don't like that Luther has been doing this because they completely believe that what the church is doing is at least decent, and that the church can reform itself without people like Luther kind of having to, start the fireworks off in public and air all the church's kind of dirty laundry and embarrassing ideas and embarrassing actions in public. So the sitting Pope, Leo X, completely hates Luther for having done this, wants to label Luther a heretic and get Luther kicked out of the church completely. And the current king of Spain, the most powerful man in the world at this point because of the American colonies that he's been pushing to expand and kind of steal all the wealth out of the Americans as much as he possibly can. He's known as Charles I in Spain, but he's not just king of Spain. He's king of parts of Italy. He's king of Austria, which is the other kind of giant military power at the time. He's king of the Dutch. He's king of a lot of lands throughout Europe. So he has the political and economic power. He has the government authority and the tax revenues and the armies on his side to really do something about this Reformation if he chooses. And he's also very close friends and a very close ally of the Pope. So they both together decide to really go after Luther. The problem, though, is that they don't just want to kill him because Luther is real famous at this point for his complaints. So if Luther is just kind of assassinated one day, that's may kill Luther, but the idea will live on, and that'll be a kind of outrage amongst the people and whatnot. So they decide, instead of trying to kill Luther, they want to force him to recant all his ideas, force him to admit that he was wrong, and that his book should be burned and banned. So they kind of force him as a church employee to show up for a public interview, basically, at a city called Worms, a city in what is now Germany. So this meeting at Worms in April 1521 is a big meeting where the Pope brings together all the major kind of intellectuals and the church leaders, the intellectuals and leaders of the church, to Worms, and they're basically just going to grill Luther with questions one day after another for several days, trying to convince him that he was wrong and that he should recant and tell the world to ignore his books, that he had made some giant mistakes. And Luther shows up to this meeting, and he defends his ideas day after day, hour after hour. And they can never really get him on anything. He does admit, though, that he will recant all of his ideas if they can prove him wrong according to what he says are, quote, reasonable scriptural arguments, which means that if you can prove to me according to the Bible somewhere in there that my beliefs are false, then I will recant, and you can ban my books and all that without my complaint. And so they, break out the book and they go after him again, hour after hour, day after day, and he defends himself with logical arguments based on the scripture. So in late April, after a couple weeks of this or so, they finally release him because they can't get him on anything. So he has defended himself well. So they release him. He starts on his way back to his home parish. But as he is traveling, the Pope releases what becomes known as the Edict of Worms, the kind of official document of the proceedings. And it concludes that Luther is still wrong, and that he is a kind of evil person, and that good church members and good religious people, good Christians all over Europe, should be very afraid of him, And the edict basically says that his books are banned. So if you are caught with his book on your person or in your home or something, that is illegal, and you can be, jailed or fined or punished in some other way. The edict also says it is illegal for anyone to give him food or shelter as he travels or as he's in his home parish. And the final kind of biggest part of the edict is that it is not illegal to kill him. So the edict says that Christians will not be judged badly by God if one of them kills him somewhere, some way, and that would be a good work for Christianity. So that's pretty controversial thing for the edict to say, but they really wanted to get rid of him at this point. So as Luther is traveling through, before he even really hears about the edict very much, he is abducted by a landowner in one of the German areas called Saxony. So basically the political leader of Saxony, one of the wealthier, larger areas in the German realm. And the elector of Saxony, this political leader, abducts Luther and hides him in his castle for a full year in order to save him from being killed. So Luther is kind of held in secret, and nobody really knows where he is for quite a while. And the elector, keeps him in his castle and feeds Luther and everything. So it's a pretty decent existence for Luther for a year, waiting for this whole Edict of Rome thing to blow over, and hopefully that Luther can survive this after he's allowed to go. But Luther, even while he's in this castle for about a year, he continues doing his work. His biggest thing is to translate the Bible into German, which was hugely illegal at the time. The Bible was written in Latin and had been ever since the Roman Empire 1500 years ago. And that was a kind of rule that the Christian church had put out, that the Bible could only be written in Latin, and any church services had to be given in Latin too, even though Latin is kind of going by the wayside as a popular language. So Luther breaks other gigantic rules in the church by translating the book into German in order to reach the average people, because a lot of Germans don't speak Latin anymore. A lot of people don't speak Latin anymore. It's kind of an ancient language by this point. Latin is really only restricted to the educated elite who study Latin basically in college for the most part. So Luther is very dedicated to the idea of bringing the religion and bringing the Reformation to the average people of Europe, so that they can understand the book themselves and make up their own mind about do they want to support this Reformation or not. But the Reformation grows out of Luther pretty quickly, even when Luther even before the Edict of Rome and before his secret house arrest in the castle. There's a lot of other Reformation leaders that rise up, that become popular, start publishing their own books and their own ideas about why the Christian church is kind of broken and corrupted and whatnot, and what you need to do to fix it. So the Reformation is not just one group that says we need to reform the church according to A, B, C, and D, and once that's done, everything's all right. There's other groups, other leaders, other philosophers who have other ideas, some shared ideas, but some want to go even further with the reforms. So the Reformation fragments pretty quickly into 10, 20, 30 different little movements. And a lot of those movements become eventually different kind of sects within Christianity, different groups. So this is where you get Baptist and Anabaptist and Lutherans and Methodist and Calvinist and on and on and on down the list. This is where the movement kind of fractures into many, many different groups, and they start to grow and spread. So there's a lot of ideas floating around about what kind of reforms are necessary, and it's hard to get a consensus amongst the people who want any kind of reform in the first place. So over time, these reform groups will start kind of protest movements, and they'll try to convince their local political leaders to endorse the Reformation and try to change their local Christian church, try to reform it in some way or other. And so they're starting protest movements. They're signing petitions to the local king or prince or duke or baron or elector or whoever you've got around that's kind of running your locality. So a lot of these different groups start calling themselves the Protestant movement, the protest movement, really. And even the Protestant movement again fractures down into dozens and dozens of different groups with their own specific ideas about what reforms are necessary. And the leftover church, the kind of big institutional church that has called itself the church or just general Christianity in Europe, that becomes known as the Catholic Church over time, the church that the Pope runs. So that's where we get these kind of definitions between Catholic and Protestant. So a lot of these religious movements, a lot of these protest and reform demands, they have big impacts on localities all around Europe. And you can see by this map that Europe is not exactly as it looks today. Europe is kind of fragmented into a lot of different kingdoms. So you see some of the big countries that we have today, Spain and Portugal are out there to the west. We've already talked about them. The kind of big pink blob to the northeast of Spain is France. So that's a major kingdom. North of them is England, this kind of country that's in green. And north of them is Scotland, and eventually England and Scotland will unify together in one unified country that will become known as Great Britain. Or today it's called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Scotland and some other places. But there's another big kingdom to the east called Austria, which is in blue on this map. So Austria is a big power also. But the big kingdoms that we don't see, the big countries that we don't see in the 1500s that we're used to seeing today are really Germany right in the middle. They can see is fragmented into anywhere around 200 different little principalities and city-level governments or counties or dukedoms or electorate or whatever they're calling their little area. So that could be broken up usually around 180 to 200 different local governments in what were then called the Germanies or the German realm. They generally speak German. They share like a kind of German culture, but they don't have any unified German political government, no German state that rules over all of them. And the same thing is true with what is today Italy. It is divided up into dozens of different small little municipalities or dukedoms or kingdoms or whatever you want to call them. So Germany and Italy are not formed yet. And they will not form for the rest of our class. They don't come together into one unified kind of entity until the later 1800s. And down toward the southeast, this purplish area is basically the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim empire that is generally trying to attack to the north and conquer more European land. So that's what Europe looks like. And because Germany and Italy are so fragmented, they're not under one ruling king or emperor or anything, that's where a lot of this Reformation has its biggest local impact. Because individual groups have much weaker politicians that run just out of the locality, so the population of that locality might be able to force their leader, their king or duke or whoever, to give in to their demands. Because a small-scale duke or elector probably doesn't have a big enough army to repress them all, and might not have enough funding to pay an army to repress them all. So especially in Germany and Italy, what is today Germany and Italy, we will see a lot of controversial attempts at coups to, say, knock out a king who is still supporting the Catholic Church, even though the population wants to become Protestant and wants the Reformation to happen. So a lot of these local politicians feel very threatened by their own politicians. So with all of these political fragmentation, in especially the Germanies and Italy, what is today Italy, a lot of local politicians feel very trapped between the demands of their people that they rule over, who may want one thing. Say if the local population wants to be Protestant or wants to be Methodist or something, and they want to change the church, change the church services. But if that politician is kind of under the thumb of a higher up entity, like this Spanish king who has a lot of military power to push people around, or if this king, this local king, is still believing in the Catholic version of Christianity and wants to follow the Pope, and the Pope is sending orders, you have to do this, these local politicians can be very much in a bind between getting orders from above and getting pressure from the people below. And several political leaders don't survive it. So a lot of them try to find some kind of middle ground to appease both sides. And a lot of the local leaders, their attempt is basically to tell the Pope, yes, I'm following orders, but really to not really follow them on the ground, to just not enforce them. Which of course would anger the Pope, and he would send letters back and forth, trying to really force the local leader's hand in doing what the Pope wants. So this is a very kind of dangerous time for a lot of local politicians. And a lot of the population will get outraged if they're not getting what they want, and they will start to do some pretty extreme things that were kind of unthinkable before the Reformation got started. And the most famous is what the textbooks will call the iconoclastic controversy. And iconoclasm simply means the breaking of images. So this is exactly what it sounds like. A lot of Protestant leading groups in certain populations, again largely in the Germanies, they would break into their local Catholic church and they would start smashing images. Because a lot of the Protestant interpretation, a lot of protest, a lot of things they don't like about the Catholic Church is that there's these images everywhere. And a lot of the Reformation theory says you should get rid of the images, because having all these statues and stained glass images in the church is really a distraction for the people in the church. They should be focusing on their relationship with God. They shouldn't be looking at these very ornate statues and paintings and stained glass windows and all these other kinds of things. That the religion should be kind of purified and made more basic for the common people. So a lot of Protestants will go into Catholic churches and just start smashing the statues or start breaking the windows. There's even instances of them smashing the altars, trying to remove the altars. In some famous cases, they even smash or try to get the church organ out of there, which is very difficult because that thing is expensive and sometimes it's even cemented in. So some of this is pretty extreme, and it could be seen as a kind of psychological release of violent anger at the oppression that people have felt at the hands of the Catholic Church possibly for years. But iconoclasm doesn't always have to mean the breaking of images. A lot of Protestant groups will go into churches and they won't destroy the images, but they'll just kind of separate them from the walls or something and just take them outside, so that they're technically just kind of cleansing the church or cleansing the building by removing the images that the Protestants didn't want in the building to start with. So it's not always like this guy on the right sneaking up on the statue and smashing it to smithereens or something like that. So we see that this the Reformation and the Protestant movement is having a big effect on localities all throughout Europe. Really, it's not just in the Germanies or the areas of modern day Italy. So there are local demands happening all over the place. And it has a big effect on European government relations with each other. And it even causes big wars, as especially in the German realm, a lot of German princes agree with the Protestant Reformation. They want to take part in it. And so they join Protestant denominations. And, the Catholic Church and the Pope are very angry about that. So the Pope will start organizing the kind of Catholic loyalist princes around Germany, or the Germanies, and build them into a kind of Catholic league, a Catholic alliance, of the major princes who can raise armies and whatnot. And of course, the Protestant princes get very afraid at that, so they start making their own league, their own alliance, to basically defend themselves against a possible Catholic attack. And those two alliances are made in the 1530s, and they argue with each other and they threaten each other for about a decade or so. But it does break out into official warfare, where they do attack each other in what becomes known as the Schmalkaldic War of 1546 to 47. And to make that long story very short, basically the Catholic princes win, and they believe that they're going to destroy the Protestant movement completely. They're going to destroy Protestantism and end the Reformation. So they forced the Protestant princes to kind of officially on paper say that they will reconvert back to Christianity, and of course a lot of them don't. So according to the treaty, just a lot of the Protestant princes just refuse to follow the terms of the treaty, which outrages the Catholic princes because they say, hey, we won the war and you signed up for this. You signed the treaty, now you have to do it. So even though the Catholic princes won the war, the Protestant idea survives and still has a lot of adherents. So that's one conflict in the 1540s, and these conflicts will continue to spread across different areas. Another one it spreads to is the Netherlands, which is basically kind of northwestern Germany, an area between what is now Germany and France. So it's kind of in the middle of Europe toward the north, up along the sea, in this kind of greenish type area. If you look real close, you can see it says Netherlands, or it might even say Spanish Netherlands, because in theory the Spanish king owned this place. This was his inheritance from one of his grandparents. So this is part of the King of Spain's official kingdom. And the King of Spain is very much Catholic, and he's very close with the Pope. So a lot of these Protestant believers in the Netherlands start demanding independence from Spain to have their own country, to continue the Protestant Reformation in their own new country. So they basically declare independence in 1557, and they start a revolt against the King of Spain, who is one of the most powerful people in the world at that point, has gigantic armies and has a huge budget. So this becomes known as the Dutch Revolt. And in its first phase will go on for 20 years. So we see independence movements rising based on the Reformation, in part at least. A lot of Dutch people don't really care about religion, and they're using the Reformation as a good excuse to declare independence and break away politically from Spain. So that's one instance, or another instance. Yet another one is in England, further to the west, up in the northwest of Europe. And England's a very complex story. Let's see if we can get through it in a couple minutes. In England, the sitting king when the Reformation started, Henry VIII, all the way to the left. He was a fairly devoted Catholic, or what became known as Catholic. He was in the Pope's church, as all Christians were before the Reformation. He was married in the Pope's church through that institutional system. And in the early 1530s, King Henry VIII, he wants to have an heir. He wants to have a boy, a child. And his wife that he had married through the Catholic Church seemed to be barren. She just could not bear children. She had one child who turned out to be a girl, and then she appeared to not be able to get pregnant again. So the king, Henry VIII, wants more children because he wants a boy, so he decides he wants to divorce his wife. So he sends a letter to the Pope asking for a divorce. Pope says, no, absolutely not. No kind of rules or laws have been breaking that would justify divorce, and divorce is very, very rare in the Catholic Church, even more rare than it is today. So Henry makes a kind of big decision. He says, well, I've got a whole bunch of people in England that are demanding the Reformation happen to reform the church. So he suddenly makes a decision that England will no longer follow the Catholic Church, that England will now be Protestant. So he is going to basically kick the Catholic Church out of England. But you have all these church buildings around, so Henry decides to build a whole new religion according to the Reformation, and he wants to build a Protestant group basically out of nowhere, and he calls this new movement the Church of England. So, creative title there. Officially becomes known as the Anglican Church. And Henry, because he wants to be in charge of the church, because he's going to ask whoever's in charge for a divorce, he decides to make himself ruler of the new English church. And so one day he asks himself for a divorce as king, and as leader of the church, he tells himself, yes, you can have a divorce, so he gets what he wants. And he kicks his wife out and divorces her, kicks her out of the country, basically. She goes back to her original home in Spain. And from that point, Henry will, start dating, basically, and will eventually marry another woman, or even a series of women, one after another, in order to try to have that child that's a boy. And, first wife has a girl, gets rid of her, has her executed, brings in another wife, and I think it's the second or third or fourth one that eventually has the boy that he wants, and he's happy. But, that child's real young. So Henry finally gets old and dies in 47. And his very young son, like 14 or something years old, becomes the next king in line. And he gets sick real quick in a couple of years, and he dies. So now Henry's dead, and his only male heir is dead. So the English throne goes to his eldest daughter, who becomes known as Mary I in 53. And Mary I was raised by her mother, which was Henry's first wife, who was very Catholic. So Mary I is very Catholic, and she decides to bring the Catholic Church back to England and get rid of Protestantism. So that leads to all kinds of problems in England. There's a threat of civil war because a lot of English people are now Protestant and they like it. Mary's big goal for the rest of her life really is to destroy Protestantism, and she persecutes Protestants and executes some in public pretty ugly ways, burning them alive basically. So a lot of Protestants hate Mary. They call her Bloody Mary for all of her repression. But then she got sick and died without any children. So the next oldest daughter, named Elizabeth, becomes the next queen, and Elizabeth has to figure out her great goal is to balance the pretty evenly matched forces between Catholics and Protestants in England by this point, because they're really at each other's throats, and there's always a threat of civil war between them, which would probably take her out also. So her big goal is to balance the two forces and just keep peace in England under her own rule. So England has a lot of big problems with the Protestant Reformation, at least politically, for quite a long time, and those problems will last beyond her time, well through the 1600s. So that's England's story with the Reformation. The Reformation is also hitting one of the other giant kingdoms in the 1500s, which is France. The French kings, going back, were also real close with the Pope and very Catholic. And the French monarchy had started persecuting Protestants, which are known as Huguenots in France, in the 1530s. And that led to what became known as the French Wars of Religion, where it's just intermittent open warfare between the Catholic government and the kind of Protestant rebels. And that goes on for decades and decades and decades, until the kind of latest king who rises in the early 1590s, named Henry IV. He issues an official proclamation about 10 years into his reign called the Edict of Nantes, which basically says that Protestants will no longer be persecuted, that they'll be allowed to openly worship in ways according to their own conscience, without the government jailing them or torturing them or massacring them or anything like that. So that is what finally ends the French Wars of Religion, and it's like another major admission that there's just so many Protestants in France, just like in England, that you just can't get rid of them all, because that'll just start more warfare and just more bloodshed and just catastrophe for the country. So the general idea is that you have to learn to live with them. You have to tolerate them. And of course, a lot of the Catholics are very angry at Henry IV for doing this. But the biggest conflict by far regarding the Reformation in Europe is the 30 Years' War. So that is absolutely massive, and as you can guess, it went on for 30 years, is mostly fought in the Germanies, and it is basically like the World War II of the era. It is massively destructive. It is massively complex. Every major government gets involved in it at some point, and it destroys a whole lot of them, bankrupts a whole lot of them. So the details are pretty extreme on that one. We just basically go on and say that uh, it's really a last attempt of the Catholic princes and the Catholic kings to destroy all Protestantism, and it fails. When a peace treaty is eventually signed in 1648, it basically offers toleration to Protestants, and it basically admits that any of these wars of religion, they just never end, and they're just catastrophic. So this is where Protestantism is kind of allowed to exist throughout Europe from 1648 forward, without much fear of attack, at least. All right, so that's the Reformation in Europe. So what impact does all this have on the Spanish and Portuguese colonies? One of the big impacts is that the Spanish government starts an official inquisition, starting in Mexico City and also in Lima in 1569. And its big goal is really to stop foreign Protestants from the rest of Europe from moving into the colonies and spreading this, what the Catholic Church will call like this heretical faith. So we have to remember that, in the 1500s and 1600s, the Spanish government is overwhelmingly Catholic, and they do not like the Reformation. They do not like having Protestants in their areas. So for the 15 and 1600s, the Spanish government is looking to unify all of its people that it rules over and make sure that they stay in the Catholic Church. So they are not one of these governments that's going to give equal toleration to Protestants. So they bring an inquisition into the colonies in 1569. And remember from earlier that there was an inquisition already going in Spain to investigate basically converted Jews, to make sure they actually converted and whatnot. So that was going on in Spain in the early 1500s and was extended into the colonies. So a kind of new wave of the Inquisition gets going in 1569 and is later extended to Cartagena in 1610. So these Inquisition, these kind of tribunals, these investigators got jurisdiction over suspected Jews, the conversos, who were officially supposed to convert to Christianity in Isabel's era. But there's always these suspicions that a lot of Jews just kind of, they officially convert to Christianity, but in secret in their own houses, in their own personal lives, they are still kind of following Jewish rituals and whatnot. So they only kind of converted on paper in order to avoid being punished. But this Inquisition will also add the suspicion of Protestantism to the list. So they also investigate suspected Protestants of not following Catholicism, and that they will be investigated also. The really interesting thing is that these Inquisitions will not have any authority over the Native Americans. So these are purely investigations into people of European ancestry that were supposed to be official members of the Catholic Church. So that sets up an interesting dynamic. This is basically the Europeans doing this among themselves, the colonizers. And one interesting result of this is that some local elites actively sought to use and cooperate with the Inquisition in the colonies because they might benefit from it. It might get rid of their rivals. So you could, if your business has a rival business that you're competing with, and you have any amount of evidence at all that the owners of that business are secretly Jewish or Protestant or something, you can just go to the authorities and just accuse them of it, and the authorities would go after them, might destroy their business, and could very likely destroy their business. So a lot of the elites see this Inquisition as an opportunity, a tool to be used for their own personal advancement in some way or other. So just to talk about the Inquisition system real quick for a couple minutes. The accused are investigated, and sometimes those investigations can go on for years. They are often arrested when the Inquisition gathers enough evidence to kind of try to prove the accusation. The arrested were completely cut off from society. They are jailed, sometimes for years. So they have very few rights. They are never informed of the charges against them, or even the groups who had accused them. It's just a charge of, the Inquisition believes that you've done something wrong. So the accused have very few rights. They are often forced to sign confessions, if a confession is even offered, to formally get back into the Catholic Church, and that might get their release. But sometimes they're sitting in jail and being investigated and interrogated for years. And that's expensive. And the Catholic Church in the colonies might not have the money to pay for it, or they don't want to pay for it. So oftentimes their property, the accused property, was confiscated and auctioned in order to pay the cost of their imprisonment. So the defendants could lose everything just based on the accusation. The defendants had little chance to prove their own innocence. They're not given lawyers. They're not given due process. They're not given access to documents. So it's really hard for them to find any proof for their innocence to get released. And a lot of the ones that sign confessions or are found guilty are forced to make some kind of public, quote, act of faith, where they would kind of confess what they've done publicly, and they would ask for some kind of forgiveness or penance, or have something done to them, so that they can prove to the whole society that they've learned their lesson and they're going to do better now. A lot of the Inquisition cases and accusations were based on kind of accusations of immorality, like bigamy or public blasphemy or some kind of immoral act. And they were often punished, if found guilty, with public flogging, which is a kind of whipping, being gagged, being forced into work on ships, galleys that would travel around. So it's kind of a forced labor, kind of a labor sentence, basically. A lot of times they would lose their property. And in some extreme cases, they were kicked out of the colony completely. They were sent into exile. And in the most extreme cases, they were executed. But only about 1% of all the formal cases in the Inquisition led to execution. So the Inquisition in Lima put on trial about 100 accused Jews, including some of the richest Jews in the city, or some of the richest businessmen in the city, business leaders in the late 1630s, and found a lot of them guilty and executed 11 of them by public burning them alive. And the rest that were found guilty were publicly flogged, publicly whipped, and then exiled. So the Inquisition had a lot of tools at its disposal, and the accused didn't have many at all, so they don't stand much chance of proving their innocence. The Inquisition could also use censorship to try to stop the spread of Protestant or Jewish ideas. So the Inquisition largely tried to keep some pamphlets and whatnot that would advertise those ideas, tried to keep them out of the colonies through censorship. So they would inspect ship cargoes looking for these kind of books when these ships landed in different ports. So government officials and church officials would be there to inspect the cargo and make sure no kind of contraband ideas or books were getting through. And they also would get warrants, basically, to search printing presses in the colonies, the few that existed, to make sure that they're not printing kind of illicit material. So they use censorship to try to stop the spread of especially Protestant Reformation-based ideas. So most of the Spanish colonial population supported the Inquisition. Historians argue it's likely because the people who supported it didn't think it was a threat against them personally. They said, I'm in the Catholic Church. I'm formally and publicly known as a dedicated church member, so it's probably not going to come after me. And a lot of these Catholics, they want to have a purified society. They don't want to have secret Jews or secret Protestants kind of milling around their society and possibly kind of, they say, corrupting their society with their blasphemies and whatnot. And again, it's often kind of politically and economically useful to the rich that might be competing with other businesses or other politicians in the area that might be easy to accuse them of breaking the church's rules. There's no formal inquisition ever established in Brazil by the Portuguese. So there is a Portuguese inquisition, but it's mostly happening in Portugal itself. So the few that were accused in Brazil were put on a boat and shipped over to Portugal for investigation and trial. The Inquisition investigators only came to Brazil 3 times during all this, over a century of this going on. And it's largely to investigate local Jewish populations in Brazil. So the punishments were usually about the same as the Spanish Inquisition. It's just on a much smaller scale. Many fewer accusations in Brazil. And again, the Inquisition had no authority, had no jurisdiction over the natives. Because the Catholic Church and church leaders often argued, and the government often agreed, that the natives were kind of they're like children basically. They don't have the intellectual capacity to get involved in these debates and try to destroy the Catholic Church or anything like that. So they look at the natives as more like children who they can't really control their immorality, so they have to be taught and controlled like children and kind of forced to keep them on the right path. But that's not the Inquisition's responsibility. That's just the church in general. So moving on to the next section, this is a discussion of like the relationship between the church and the government and the society in the colonies. The church really started out in the Americas with these kind of utopian visions of saving the world and these massive native populations that have to be converted, and we're going to save all these people's souls and we're going to show them the right path. So that's really how the church got going in the colonies. And that was their expectation and their hope. So they're starting off with these very grandiose visions of saving the world and whatnot, saving the human population. And over time, their conversion rates were so low, and they're very suspicious that a lot of natives just converted to avoid being kind of oppressed, that the church very much pulled back on those ideas and pulled back on their ambitions and their goals. So eventually, by getting into the kind of mid-1500s, the church's official goal kind of scales back to really just kind of helping natives and colonists live together, setting up bureaucratic systems for like social services, like education or charity or something that the colonial government was just not doing. So they, again, they scale back their ambitions pretty heavily from, converting every single native and saving their souls to setting up a kind of social services institutional system to help the natives adapt to European society and help people get along with each other and whatnot, and help them survive kind of economic downturns or teach them basic reading and writing skills or something like that. There is still some clerical activism in the colonies. There are some very active church leaders and priests who go out and they really still want to convert as many people as possible. And the church largely starts, as an institution, starts focusing on integrating itself into the kind of daily social life in the colonies, and again, setting up kind of social services and helping people. And the church is also very interested in establishing its own power and making sure it's an important institution in the colonies. So over time, there's not enough clerics, there's not enough church employees who come over from Europe. So over time, the churches become dominated amongst their own employees by American-born clerics who were born in the colonies, and they went through the education system, and they went through the church system. And after a few generations, they're the ones that are really the kind of heavy presence inside the church that are running the institutions. So that happens over a few generations. It's pretty general, the kind of experience in a colony setting. The government tried to keep patronage power and control over the church establishment in the colonies. So the government often tries to use the church as an institution for its own government interest. And they try to control really who is involved in the church in the colonies as an employee. And the government can do that because it's very difficult to get to the colonies and it's expensive. So the government will try to control the church's resources in the colonies. The government will set the kind of land and labor and sales taxes that will create the tithe, which is the kind of official tax that creates funding for the churches. So the government tries to control that in order to control the amount of money that the churches can get. So if the churches start complaining about what the government's doing, they can just scale back the funding and harm the church's power that way. Another way is to control the appointment of who gets into the clergy. And the government was able to do that by making deals with the church leaders in Europe, and also saying the church doesn't often pay for the clergy to travel back and forth from Europe to the colonies. So the government has the ships that go back and forth that do that on a yearly basis. So the government starts trying to control passports and tickets for the church leaders to go back and forth. And therefore they control, or they try to control, which clergy actually get to the colonies. So in that way, the government is trying to determine who the church employees are in the colonies. And the government also tries to control the construction of new church groups, buildings, because a lot of that needs government permits. So the government will try to control how many churches and how many church-based hospitals and convents or whatnot are built in different cities. So there's a kind of power struggle between the colonial governments and the imperial governments based in Iberia and the Catholic Church either in Europe or in the colonies. So it's a very complex kind of system that they're kind of vying for power and influence, often against each other. And the church itself, number one, it attempts to really wipe out the native religions as much as it possibly can, in order to build up itself and replace the native religions with its own belief system. So the church has several ways or methods of trying to destroy the native religious ideas and get them to forget all that stuff over several generations and all convert to Catholicism. The biggest and probably most famous and most infamous system is that the church just started persecuting native religious leaders. So they realized that a lot of these natives are converting to Christianity just in name, just doing it on paper to kind of avoid being oppressed as much as they possibly can, and that when they go back to their people, the native groups, that they still try to lead native religious rituals and ceremonies and ideas and whatnot. So a lot of the church leaders will try to basically persecute them, to jail them and accuse them of secretly plotting against the church and whatnot. So that'll have some effect. But again, just because you jail the current church or native religious leaders doesn't mean that they won't be replaced within that native community by other religious leaders. So the church leaders also figure that they have to really break down that belief system in the general native population. And one way they hit on doing that is to learn the native languages so that they could preach the Catholic religion to natives in the native language and try to replace the native religion, gain more converts since you speak the religion. So especially in Mexico, the church will send hundreds of Catholic employees into Mexico to build Nahuatl schools and try to teach the main native language to kind of all the different native groups, and then ensure that these native groups are starting to learn more Christianity through the Catholic sect over time. And it was also they try to continue using the Nahuatl language largely because the Spanish colonists, don't speak it. So if the church can form a shared language with these native groups that the colonists, the government, doesn't have any access to, then the church can build a kind of friendship with the native groups and possibly just teach them things that the government doesn't want them to know. So that's a method of the church building power also. But a lot of Spaniards and colonists, they reject that idea because they say working with native languages and customs and whatnot is a compromise, and it's idolatry and heretical and all that. So there's a big controversial kind of conversation going on amongst the Spanish and the church about what should be the tactic to follow to gain more converts amongst the natives. Another method is that the church tried to break a lot of the kind of political and cultural norms that the natives were used to, coming out of their own cultures and their own religious ideas. So the church specifically focused on trying to break polygamy, the practice of having like several marriages. They tried to break a lot of the native political organization, and this is largely through building a mission system. Build these smaller scale missions, these churches all over the place in the colonies, as a system to keep the natives on site living in the mission, so that they are exposed to Catholicism. They're exposed to even European languages and lifestyles and work habits and all these types of things, and to try to keep them on site so that you can stop them from the several marriages they've got and all the idolatry they're used to participate in and whatnot. And the government really liked the mission system and would help fund it because it also serves the government's interest of breaking the native populations apart into smaller groups, which would help to keep them controllable. And if you can teach them European lifestyles, that might reduce their possibility of rebelling against the government in the future, against the colonies. So the church tried for several decades to break native polygamy, the practice of several marriages, and eventually did break the kind of native official polygamy, where under native law or native official government practice they would have several different documented wives. So they'd only have kind of one marriage per couple, but the native practice of it still continued. They just did it unofficially. So the church leaders were constantly frustrated at that. The Peruvian leaders and the Peruvian church in the Spanish colony known as the Viceroyalty of Peru by the mid-1500s, they were much less aggressive in a lot of ways against native beliefs. They didn't want to fully eradicate the native beliefs really until the 1550s. And that's possibly because, remember from a previous lecture, the Spanish leaders in Peru were basically fighting each other. So this was the kind of Pizarro rebellions and the civil wars with the Almagro faction and all that. That's going on in the 1530s and 1540s. So maybe the leadership was just too split and infighting amongst itself to try to heavily repress and eradicate the native belief systems. But they do, attempt to formally say that things like all the natives who had lived in the years before the Spanish made contact, that they're all now in hell, and that any of the natives who worship those ancestors or those mummies or those icons of them, that's all illegal, and that all those icons should be destroyed and burned. And of course that caused uproar amongst the native Andeans who, hated that the church was doing that, the government was doing that. So they started a counter belief that the ancestors were angry for being betrayed, and that the ancestors would send plagues and other kind of natural disasters as punishment for the living Andeans for even considering kind of selling out their ancestors and their religion to the Europeans. So the church, there's this kind of theoretical infighting, theological fighting between the church and the native groups, and the church generally gains the upper hand in the 1570s. And the church's attempts at pacifying natives all over the Spanish colonies especially will start conflicts with the colonial government and even colonial elites, because a lot of the settlers and colonists and investors in the lands and companies and whatnot, they wanted the converted natives to work as laborers on the lands or in the businesses or in the mines or something like that. And the church often tried to protect the natives who had converted to Catholicism from what the church called exploitation. So there's often kind of angry conflicts and arguments between church leaders and local colonial officials and landowners and investors over what should be done with these native converts. And the church would often help individual natives and even groups of natives bring court cases within the Spanish court system in the colony to try to sue for their freedom or sue for getting away from whatever oppression they were experiencing. Unfortunately, the court system is a government operation, so the courts often sided with the settlers and the government kind of side in this. Both the Spanish and the governments, Portuguese governments, increasingly defined settlers' rights and investors' rights over time, and increasingly restricted the church's control over the native laborers and native individuals, because the government and the investors and the landowners, they need those native converts as a workforce. So a lot of church groups are very angry at that kind of long-term development. And one Jesuit group on the Brazil-Paraguay border even gave weapons to the natives to protect themselves against slave traders from the Brazilian coastline. And another specific Jesuit leader was exiled from the colony for prompting the natives into open revolt against the repression of the landowners. And also, while all this infighting and arguments going on within the colony itself, outside of the colony in Europe, a lot of the European powers that are rivals with Spain and Portugal and are trying to break into the colonial game in the late 1500s, mid-late 1500s, they will use the accusation that the Spanish and the Portuguese are extremely cruel and brutal and intolerant toward these innocent childlike natives. They will use that argument to delegitimize the Spanish and Portuguese colonization efforts, because these other governments in the Netherlands, what becomes known as the Dutch Republic, or in England, or in France, they're going to advertise those ideas in order to delegitimate the Spanish colonies and argue that it's perfectly justifiable for our government to attack those colonies and to take land from those colonies because they're mistreating and brutalizing the natives so much. And that becomes known over time as a, quote, black legend of all this Iberian cruelty against the natives and how unjustified and horrific it is. But whenever we hear about the black legend, and especially these accusations coming from imperial rivals like the Dutch or the English or the French, we should remember that they're promulgating those ideas and spreading those ideas because politically they want to destroy the Spanish colonies and take a chunk for themselves. And we also have to remember that a lot of those governments are run by Protestants in England or the Dutch Republic. So there's also a kind of Reformation side to this, that these Protestants think that Catholicism is automatically corrupt and arbitrary. So they'll use that as an accusation that the Catholic religion shouldn't be running colonies in the New World because it is automatically corrupt, and therefore it will corrupt these innocent natives. So the black legend becomes a big, big thing by the mid to late 1500s and will spread and continue for many, many years, even into the 1800s. where these rival governments will start attacking Spanish colonies and whatnot. So another internal kind of argument between the Catholic Church and the kind of colonial governments and colonial settlers is over the amount of tax revenue that they should be allowed to have. And that tax revenue was called a tithe. So that term goes way back into medieval Europe. So especially after there's a kind of agricultural colonial boom in the economy after about the year 1590, as the economy grows and there's more sales and exchanges going on, the tithe is largely based on a sales tax in the colony, so that would increase the amount of revenue that went to the church and church bodies throughout the colonies. And the government and the settlers would become kind of worried about that because they know what the church does with that money. They try to increase their influence and increase the amount of natives in their missions and whatnot that they're trying to protect from exploitation. So that's a kind of ongoing argument over how much money the church should be getting these taxes, these government collected taxes. And the church also starts going into land ownership in the mid to late 1500s. So the Catholic Church and its entities will start buying up land, not just to build new churches on or new convents or missions or whatever, but they also buy a lot of farmland out around that area, which they would grow food on and sell at market for the prices they wanted to make money. And they would often rent that land to other farmers so that the church would just make money off of the rent. And so that angers a lot of settlers and investors and whatnot, because now the church is becoming an economic entity that is competing for land. And in this ancient type of society, land is the engine of wealth. People get rich off of land ownership. So the church will start gobbling up huge amounts of land, and eventually the Catholic Church will become one of the biggest landowners in all of the colonies. So a lot of investors who want to buy land themselves are very angry about this. And they start complaining about the church's authority and it has too much wealth and it's corrupt and all these things. So that feeds into also the Reformation complaints about the church's corruption and how it has to be updated or reformed. The church also went into the loan business, really. It would give loans to investors, people who wanted to buy land or do whatever, basically like a mortgage. So if there's no bankers or no big elite people who have money to lend at interest, a person who needs a loan to start their business or buy land or whatever, they could go to their local Catholic church and they could get a loan for about 5 or 6% or so on top of the loan that you would have to pay back. So you would make that, monthly payments and whatnot. So it very much resembled a mortgage today. But the church said that those interest rates, that was not interest, because according to the Bible, you're not supposed to give loans with interest attached because it's called usury, which is one of the kind of big sins. So the church said that extra 5 or 10 or whatever percentage they're charging, that's just a fee for the transaction, which is different from an interest rate. And the church also ran a lot of kind of social services and gave sanction to a lot of big events in individual people's lives. And they would charge fees for those events. So if you want to get married in the Catholic Church or through the church's institution and get the church to officially sign off on it to legitimize the marriage, you had to pay a fee for that. If you wanted to have a church burial for somebody, you had to pay a fee for that. So the churches are also collecting fees from the colonists. And of course, they use those fees and the fees from the loans that they're giving to often buy more land, or even they start investing in businesses. So a lot of these fees and the lands that the church are owning is making the church fairly rich. And even making some of the church leaders that are running these systems are getting personally rich. So these church groups become some of the biggest landowners in the colonies. They become some of the richest entities in any of the colonies. So they start accruing a lot of power, and they start getting involved in a lot of just private business ventures. Jesuits especially will go into commodity markets. They will get involved in buying and reselling wine, textiles, clothing or cloth-based products, pottery, and eventually they'll even get involved in slave owning and selling slaves. The churches will build some of the big institutions that the government was not building, largely educational institutions like schools, colleges, universities. Colonial governments didn't really have the funding to construct those kind of systems, and the church had an interest in doing that because they wanted to educate the local population, at least to educate their own future bureaucrats and leaders within their own institution. So they would often bring students through the school and college system to get them educated enough to basically take over for me if I retire or when I retire. So they're training their bureaucratic replacements basically. So really every major city in what we now know as Latin America, except for maybe Buenos Aires, eventually got a major Catholic university or a Jesuit university or something like that. And often it's the Creoles, the mixed race students who attend these schools, because they're the ones that are looking to gain offices in the church or in the government, so they need the education. A lot of the elite Spaniards or major landowners, they often have the money to pay tutors to train their own children. So it's often the mixed race, kind of more working class or middle class Creoles that attend the universities, and they're looking for the opportunity to get good kind of government or church-based jobs for a career, since they're not rich from birth basically. And a lot of the Iberians resisted this because they didn't like the idea of Creoles running the church in any level. So a lot of the native Iberians, the church leaders in Iberia, argued that only Iberians should be appointed to at the highest levels of the churches to run even the colonial churches. But again, even where the Iberians are successful in getting those policies passed, it's largely the Creoles, the mixed race people, who would dominate the lower kind of local church levels. The church would also build nunneries and convents, places for female education, not just to educate women, but also to teach them the arts, and a lot of kind of elite colonial families will send their girls to live in convents and be educated there for them to be controlled so that they don't get involved in immoral or something like that activities. So they can be very closely watched to have their purity or whatever to be guarded by the church. A lot of girls and young women chose to go into the convents or the nunneries because these were places of education where they'd be surrounded with like-minded young women, and a lot of them hated male dominance, so they would go to these places to be educated, to be around other women who shared their ideals, and also to get away from men that were trying to marry them and kind of dominate them and keep them in the home. So these were kind of educational and possibly even career opportunities for want to go along with the kind of mainstream interpretation of femininity and how they would just kind of serve their husbands and whatnot. So for some women it's an opportunity. For others, obviously, they viewed even the nunneries as fairly oppressive. So it really breaks down according to kind of individual interpretation and goals. So the convents themselves often owned or rented urban land, land in cities, and issued mortgages and gave loans and such to get funding from themselves. But the convents or the nunneries, they never owned agricultural land that they would work themselves or they would rent out. So their income is kind of restricted for the long term. The nunneries often also took donations from wealthy families who sent their daughters there to be educated under confinement to make sure that the church would guard their purity and their morality and all that kind of stuff. So that was another source of funding, especially for the convents and the nunneries. But you combine all this stuff together, and the church is a big money-making operation in the colonies, and one of the biggest money-making operations. So it becomes a very powerful kind of institution in colonial society. So it's on par with the government in a lot of places. It's has big buildings. It owns a lot of land. It has big time revenues. It has a lot of influence over the population. So a lot of upper and middle class families would try to get their family members kind of into the church because the church is so influential, and these wealthy, powerful families want to have a voice in the institution. So if I'm like a big landowner in the colonies and I'm running a big business and I have a large family and I have, I don't know, 6 or 8 kids or something like that, I would try to ensure that one of my sons goes into the church and is educated there and becomes a church bureaucrat. Or one of my daughters would go into the nunneries and become one of the leaders of a nunnery in order to guarantee that I have some kind of access to that power system and that I have some kind of influence within that power system. So just like I would try to marry my children off to make political and economic alliances with other businesses or with the court system or with lawyers or something like that, a lot of these kind of arranged marriages or even arranged education, I would choose that for my children at their very young age. I would decide which one's going to go have a career in the church, which one's going to become a lawyer, which one's going to be married to the children of some other business owner, to kind of strategically combine our economic interest in order to get my family to kind of spread out in all the major institutions and power bases in the society. So I would do that to try to kind of increase and enhance my power, or at least guarantee that my power doesn't fall behind, because other of my rivals are probably doing the same thing. So when we hear all these stories about people being kind of marriages of alliances or marriages of opportunity, that's what we mean when we say a lot of people did not get married or pursue careers because they love those careers or because they love the person they're marrying. A lot of that is chosen for them by their elders, by the older generation. And it's largely to ensure that families have access to the major economic, social, and political forces of their time. And we'll talk more in the future lectures about how those economic and social and political forces evolve and develop in the 15 and 1600s, and even getting into the 1700s by the time we take the next test. So we'll stop here for today, and we'll continue on with the kind of development of these societies, these colonial societies, in future lectures.